Silence had always been my safest place. Not because I liked being quiet, but because speaking never changed anything. I learned that early. How words could be twisted, how truth could be bent until it looked like a lie, and how people smiled while doing damage they would never admit to. From the outside, everything seemed normal. People saw calm days, routine mornings, and a girl who never caused trouble. They didn't see how silence slowly became a habit, and then a shield, and then a prison I didn't know how to escape. Every morning began the same way. I woke up before everyone else, not because I had to, but because the quiet before sunrise was the only time my thoughts didn't feel heavy. The world felt softer then, like it hadn't yet decided to test me. I would sit by the window, watching the sky change colors, pretending that the day ahead wouldn't demand more patience than I had left. By the time others woke up, I had already practiced my expressions, neutral, calm, unbothered. No one ever suspects the person who looks fine. The first time I realized something was wrong, it didn't come like a storm. It came gently, disguised as concern. A comment here, a suggestion there. People I trusted started speaking for me, deciding things on my behalf, correcting my words before I even finished my sentences. At first, I thought it was care. Then I thought maybe I was too sensitive. That's how it starts. Doubt planted so quietly that you water it yourself. I watched as my space grew smaller. Decisions that used to be mine were suddenly discussed without me. My mistakes were remembered longer than anyone else's, repeated like lessons I was supposed to learn from, while their own actions were quickly forgiven and forgotten. Whenever I tried to explain myself, the room would shift. Faces would harden. The tone would change. I learned that explaining only made things worse, so I stopped. There were moments I almost spoke up, moments when my chest burned with words begging to come out. But every time I opened my mouth, I remembered how it ended before. How my honesty had once been used against me, reshaped into something ugly. Silence felt safer than being misunderstood again. So I swallowed everything, anger, sadness, confusion, and told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was strong enough to endure. Time passed, but endurance doesn't mean healing. It means surviving while something inside you slowly breaks. I became good at pretending. I smiled when expected. I laughed at jokes that hurt. I nodded along to stories that rewrote my reality. People praised my patience, not knowing it was forced. They called me mature, not realizing maturity had been demanded of me far too early. The betrayal, when it finally revealed itself, didn't shock me. It disappointed me, deeply. I had trusted someone with pieces of my truth, believing they would protect them. Instead, those pieces were shared, exaggerated, and thrown back at me when it was convenient. Private moments became public entertainment. My silence was interpreted as guilt. Lies traveled faster than I ever could. I remember sitting alone that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation in my head. Not to blame myself, though I tried, but to understand where I had gone wrong. That's when it hit me. I hadn't gone wrong. I had been quiet in a place that rewarded noise. I had been honest in a space built on manipulation. My mistake wasn't trusting. It was staying silent after trust was broken. Still, I didn't react. Not then. I watched. I listened. I learned. Silence, I realized, could be a weapon too, if used correctly. While others assumed I was unaware, I was paying attention. Patterns began to appear. The same people who questioned my intentions defended each other without hesitation. The same voices that dismissed my feelings demanded understanding for themselves. Hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. On the surface, nothing changed. Underneath, everything did. I started documenting. Not on paper, but in memory. Words said. Promises broken. Actions that didn't match intentions. I stopped reacting emotionally and started observing logically. It was painful, seeing people clearly for the first time. But it was also freeing. I noticed how easily stories were controlled by those who spoke the loudest. How confidence, even when false, convinced others faster than truth spoken softly. I understood then why I had lost before. It wasn't because I was wrong. It was because I didn't know the rules of the game being played around me. There were nights I cried quietly, careful not to let anyone hear. Not because I felt weak, but because holding everything in had become exhausting. I mourned the version of myself who believed kindness was always enough, who thought patience would eventually be rewarded. Growing up means learning that fairness is not guaranteed, and silence is often mistaken for permission. When opportunities were taken from me, I was told it was for my own good. When my efforts were ignored, I was told to try harder. When credit was given elsewhere, I was told not to seek validation. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a cage. Yet even then, I didn't seek revenge. Not in the way people imagine it: anger, confrontation, chaos. I wanted justice, not noise. I wanted clarity, not applause. Most of all, I wanted control over my own story again. The turning point came quietly. A small moment most people would overlook. A conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. My name mentioned casually, followed by laughter. That laugh stayed with me longer than the words themselves. It wasn't cruel. It was comfortable. That was worse. It meant the harm had become normal to them. Something shifted inside me then. Not rage. Resolve. I realized waiting for fairness was pointless. Waiting for apologies was pointless. If I wanted things to change, I would have to change my approach. Silence had protected me long enough. Now it was time to use what I had learned. I began rebuilding, not outwardly but internally. I sharpened my awareness. I strengthened my boundaries. I stopped sharing pieces of myself with people who had proven they didn't deserve them. Slowly, my silence transformed from weakness into strategy. I let people underestimate me. I let them believe their version of me was correct. Underestimation creates comfort, and comfort creates mistakes. I watched as they became careless with their words, confident that I would never challenge them. They forgot that quiet doesn't mean blind. At times, doubt returned. Late at night, I questioned myself. Was I becoming something I hated? Was holding on to this plan poisoning me? But every time I considered letting it go, I remembered the laugh. I remembered the lost chances. I remembered how easily my pain had been dismissed. Revenge, I learned, isn't always about hurting others. Sometimes it's about reclaiming what was taken from you. Your voice, your truth, your power. I wasn't planning destruction. I was planning exposure, to reality, not rumors. As days passed, I noticed small victories. People started questioning the narratives they had been fed. Inconsistencies surfaced. Things didn't add up anymore. Not because I accused anyone, but because I stopped covering for them with my silence. I chose my moments carefully. A sentence here, a clarification there. Always calm, always factual. No emotion to attack, no anger to dismiss. The truth, delivered quietly, has a way of echoing louder than lies shouted in confidence. Some noticed the change. They asked if I was okay. I smiled and said yes. Because for the first time in a long time, I was. Not because things were fixed, but because I was no longer helpless. I knew this was only the beginning. The real consequences hadn't arrived yet. But they would. Actions have a way of circling back, especially when someone finally stops absorbing the impact meant for others. I stayed patient. Strategic patience. The kind that waits not out of fear, but out of certainty. Every step I took was deliberate. Every word measured. I wasn't rushing toward revenge. I was letting it build naturally, rooted in truth. And as I stood there, watching the world continue as if nothing had changed, I understood something clearly. The girl who stayed silent for years was still here, but she was no longer the same. Silence was no longer my prison. It was my advantage. If you enjoy powerful, emotional, and real-life inspired stories, where silence speaks louder than words and truth finds its own way, then support the channel. Your one subscribe, and one like help these stories reach more people who need to hear them. I didn't announce my change. I didn't warn anyone. People who plan revenge loudly often lose control early. I chose the opposite path. I blended back into the background, letting everyone believe I was still the same quiet presence. Observant, harmless, forgettable. That illusion was important. When people stop paying attention to you, they reveal themselves without fear. I started with distance. Not the obvious kind that raises questions, but a subtle one. Fewer reactions. Shorter responses. Neutral expressions. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fill. It was fascinating how uncomfortable some people became when I no longer carried conversations on my shoulders. Without my agreement, their stories felt incomplete. Soon I noticed the first cracks. They spoke more, explained more, over-explained. Lies need maintenance, and maintenance creates pressure. I watched them contradict themselves in small ways, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to be remembered. I remembered everything. I didn't collect evidence like a detective. I collected patterns like a student of human behavior, who spoke when they felt threatened, who changed sides when attention shifted, who defended whom without asking questions. Every pattern told a story more honest than words ever could. There was a moment when one of them tried to pull me back into the old role. The listener, the absorber, the silent supporter. They spoke casually, expecting my usual nods. Instead, I asked one simple question. Calm, polite, clear. The room changed instantly. Nothing dramatic happened, but something invisible broke. Authority that relies on silence doesn't survive curiosity. From that day on, they watched me more closely. I could feel it, but they still underestimated me, and that was their biggest mistake. They thought I wanted confrontation. They prepared for arguments. What they didn't prepare for was consistency. I began speaking only when necessary, and only the truth. No opinions, no emotions, just facts shared at the right time with the right people. I never attacked anyone directly. I let reality do the work. People trust what they discover themselves far more than what they're told. Slowly, perspectives shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but enough. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Defenses sounded rehearsed. Justifications came before accusations. The same people who once dismissed me now avoided eye contact, unsure of what I knew and what I might say next. There were moments when they tried to provoke me. Subtle remarks, old labels, attempts to pull an emotional reaction out of me. I didn't give them one. Emotional reactions give people power. Calm takes it away. At times, I wondered if this was truly revenge or simply balance being restored. I wasn't taking anything from them that they hadn't taken from themselves. I was just stepping out of the way and letting consequences land where they always should have. The most interesting part was watching how quickly loyalty faded. People who once stood confidently behind lies began to retreat when those lies required defense. No one wants to drown for a story they didn't write. I didn't have to expose anyone fully. They did it themselves, piece by piece. One evening, someone finally confronted me. Not angrily, but nervously. They asked why things felt different. Why people were questioning old stories. Why silence suddenly felt heavy. I looked at them and answered honestly, without accusation. I said nothing had changed. I had just stopped carrying what wasn't mine. That answer stayed with them. I know it did, because after that, apologies began appearing. Not public ones, not dramatic ones, but quiet admissions wrapped in excuses. I accepted none of them. Forgiveness is not a requirement for peace. Understanding is. The final shift came unexpectedly. An opportunity that had once been taken from me returned. Not as charity, but as correction. No one admitted fault. They didn't need to. The reversal said everything words never would. I didn't celebrate. I simply accepted it, knowing how much it cost to get there. By then, the dynamic had completely changed. I was no longer the background figure. I wasn't dominant either. I was independent, untouchable. When you stop needing validation, people lose the ability to control you. I realized then that revenge had already happened. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in many quiet ones. In respect returning naturally. In manipulation losing its grip. In silence no longer being mistaken for weakness. There was no final confrontation scene. No raised voices. No tears. Life isn't always cinematic. Sometimes the strongest endings are the calmest ones. I walked away without announcing my departure, leaving behind a version of myself that no longer existed. Looking back, I don't regret staying silent for as long as I did. Silence taught me patience. It taught me awareness. It taught me how people behave when they think they're unobserved. But I also learned this. Silence should be a choice, not a cage. The girl who once believed endurance was strength has learned something deeper. Strength is knowing when to endure, and when to stand still and let the truth move for you. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like growth that leaves others behind, confused about how they lost control without ever being attacked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ruin anyone. I simply reclaimed myself. And that was enough.